Talks between the Taliban and senior Afghan politicians have begun in Moscow, and despite no official from the current Afghan government in attendance, the talks have been described as fruitful by both sides. Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani has, however, dismissed the talks and said that the attending officials have no negotiating authority. Meanwhile, the former Afghan President Hamid Karzai, who is part of the delegation, said that the talks have so far gone well and that he hopes the Afghan government will be part of the talks at a later stage. The Taliban, however, has now demanded a new constitution and an inclusive Islamic state to govern the country, calling the current constitution invalid and full of Western influence. The talks also come 10 days after the peace negotiations between the US and the Taliban in Qatar ended with some signs of progress as well. Both talks, however, have excluded the Afghan government.
We understand that the government in Kabul needs to be part of these negotiations. We wish that they would have been here today, but that's an issue that has to be resolved between the Islamic movement of the Taliban, whose representatives are here to speak about, and the Afghan government.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo spoke with Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to achieving a lasting peace in Afghanistan. The U.S. President Donald Trump also, while delivering the State of the Union address this morning, had said that the negotiations to reach a political settlement in Afghanistan had been accelerated. The U.S. Secretary of State also emphasized the importance of an intra-Afghan dialogue and the role of a ceasefire in ending the violence in the region. Julia Chapman is now joining us live from Moscow for the very latest on these peace talks that are underway in Russia as we speak between representatives from Afghanistan, Taliban, and of course other member countries as well. And Julia, where are we at these Moscow talks so far? We believe that the Taliban has asked for a new constitution, an Islamic state that is far away from Western influences that the current constitution under Ashraf Ghani has.
Yes, that's right. The Taliban have been making a number of demands during these ongoing talks, not least that the Afghan government create a new constitution for the country which is based on Islamic law. That's one of their demands. They've also been asking for sanctions against them to be lifted and for the US to release any of its Taliban prisoners in Afghanistan. So those are some of the demands that they've been making. But as far as concessions, we understand that there are suggestions that the Taliban could also vow to end cooperating with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State terrorist groups. So that's some progress on that side, but whether that concession will actually be made or whether any concrete agreement will come of that remains to be seen. But it does appear that there is some sort of movement on these talks. They do seem to be going reasonably well between these parties, but of course, as you say, some of the major players simply are not here in Moscow. The Russian government is not actually participating, the US government is not participating, and of course, most crucially of all, the Afghan government is not involved. The Taliban refuses to acknowledge their authority, and President Ashraf Ghani says that he won't deal with the Taliban because they don't acknowledge that he is the rightful leader of Afghanistan and that his government has the authority. So he's dismissed these talks as nothing more than a fairy tale, and he says no concrete progress can be made without the decision maker, and that, he says, is himself.
Right, Julia. Some very important points being highlighted there by Julia Chapman, reporting from Moscow, saying many of the important stakeholders not present at this meeting. So the legitimacy of this will be questioned at some point as well. Julia, thanks very much indeed for joining us with the latest there. Well, after months of frenzied Yellow Vest protests, the French Parliament has now passed a new bill that aims to curb violent protests in the country. The bill was passed with an overwhelming majority in the response to a wave of anti-government Yellow Vest agitations that have rocked France in the past 2 months. The new anti-hooligan law bans protesters from hiding their faces. It also gives police greater powers to extract potential troublemakers from demonstrations and grants local authorities the right to ban individual protesters.
Aller et venir ont peur de le faire. Il est temps que cela cesse. Percuter les vitrines et les forces de l'ordre, ce n'est pas percuter les esprits.
Meanwhile, for the first time since the start of the anti-government protests, French unions have also joined the Yellow Vest protesters. Thousands of protesters hailing from the French unions marched with the Yellow Vest protesters in the western French city of Nantes and the capital Paris to protest the French President Emmanuel Macron's government. Protesters carrying banners and flags chanted anti-government slogans. Hundreds marched to denounce the difficult conditions in the country's employment sector and income inequality.
Il faut discuter et trouver des revendications communes, on les a, et il n'y a aucune raison qu'on ne défile pas côte à côte, les uns derrière les autres. Et ce qui est important, c'est qu'on réussit une première journée ensemble, en semaine, parce que je trouve que le patronat est ménagé et il est temps aussi qu'on demande des comptes aux grands patrons de ce pays.
And my colleague Alina is now joining us live from Paris for the very latest on this government law that has been brought in to curtail protesters. And Alina, what are the details of this new law that the French government has brought, and how is it going to in any way help while the protesters are now being joined by union groups as well?
So the more controversial aspects of the bill are that it creates a list of known troublemakers who would be banned from future protests. It allows police to set up a security perimeter around protests and treat it as you would, for example, a football stadium on match day. Everyone going in would have their identity checked, and those who are on the banned list wouldn't be allowed to pass. It also bans people from covering their faces during a demonstration. It's been described by Amnesty International, amongst other NGOs, as extremely dangerous for civil liberties, and it's extremely controversial in the heart of President Macron's own La République En Marche party. Yesterday's vote saw more than 50 pro-Macron MPs refuse to support the law. They abstained, and it was only passed with the basis of support from the La Républicain centre-right opposition. This isn't the final vote on this bill. It then has to go to the Senate and then come back to the Assemblée Nationale, the MPs, for a final vote. So it's not likely to end up on Macron's desk for signing before around the middle of March.
Right, Alina. So thanks for that. So the Yellow Vest protests continue in France now, and the government, of course, is now pushing that law, which still has a long way to go. But Alina, stay with us now. The other big story, of course, so for the first time in the history of the Catholic Church, the Pope has publicly acknowledged the scandal of priests and bishops sexually abusing nuns. Speaking at the news conference while returning to Rome from the United Arab Emirates, the Pope not only acknowledged the problem but vowed to do more to fight the problem. The acknowledgement comes just 2 weeks before the Pope hosts an unprecedented gathering of bishops to craft a global response to the scandal of priests who target children and the superiors who have covered up the crime as well.
Adesso il suo, è vero, dentro della Chiesa c'è stato anche dei chierici e in alcune civilizzazioni un po' più forti degli altri. Non è una cosa che tutti fanno quello, ma ci sono stati sacerdoti e anche vescovi che hanno fatto quello.
And well, Alina is still with us. And Alina, well, how important is this announcement by the Pope himself? Now, there have been so many scandals when it comes to the Catholic Church, but this is the first admission at the highest level and could possibly improve things going forward.
Yes, this is the first admission by the Church that priests or bishops have conducted abuse of nuns, which is a long-running scandal within the Church. There are numerous cases in Latin America, in India, in Italy. It's thought that the Pope was specifically referring to a case that happened here in France, where there was an intervention by the previous Pope Benedict against a group called the Confederation of Sisters of St. John, where there was, in south of France, where there was a serial abuser, a priest who was a serial abuser who passed away some years ago, but who was thought to be responsible for abusing a number of nuns. So it is the first public admission that this problem exists, and it comes, as you were saying there, just 2 weeks before the Pope gathers bishops and cardinals from around the world in Rome for a conference on what the Church should do to move on from these abuse scandals. Obviously a very difficult, a very controversial topic for the Pope to address, and something he rarely talks about in public, but an important admission. that this ongoing historical problem, and indeed current problem, with the sexual abuse of nuns exists.
Right, Elena, thanks very much indeed for joining us with the latest on that big story coming in with Pope Francis. They're announcing that action will be taken at some level to stop the sexual abuse that has ridden the church for many years now. Well, in news from India now, in a major boost for women in Kerala, the Travancore Devasam Board, which manages Sabrimala and the shrine, has told the Supreme Court that women of all age groups will be allowed to pray at the Lord Ayyappa temple. The 5-judge constitutional bench of the Supreme Court today heard over 60 petitions that sought a rethink of the verdict. During the hearing, Justice Indu Malhotra, the lone dissenting judge in the Sabrimala verdict, specifically asked the board's counsel if that was the stand the board wanted to take. The board's lawyer, Rakesh Dwivedi, replied that the board has now decided to respect the judgment and has also filed an application in this regard. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has reserved its order on whether to admit review petitions seeking review of its Sabrimala verdict. Earlier, appearing for the Nair Service Society, the senior advocate Shekhar Napade argued that religion is essentially a matter of faith and the court mustn't interfere unless a practice is barred by criminal law. The petitioner's lawyer also told the court that only the community can decide the custom and not the courts. Arguing its case, the Kerala government has called on the top court not to review the Sabrimala verdict. The Kerala government argued that the exclusion of women is not essential to the Hindu religion, as women are allowed in other Ayyappa temples. The Supreme Court, in its judgment in September, had said that the practice barring women from the temple is akin to untouchability. Last year, the verdict set off a massive street protest in Kerala. The annual pilgrimage season saw violent protests as devotees of Lord Ayyappa, the celibate god, tried to stop women and girls between the ages of 10 and 50 years from entering the shrine. One of the two women who eventually managed to enter the temple in January was even attacked allegedly by her mother-in-law. The issue has also triggered a political slugfest between Kerala CPM and other opposition parties. And Jessica Taneja, our special correspondent, is now joining us live from New Delhi for the latest on what the Supreme Court has said and is expected to do. Now, Jessica, take us through the court proceedings today, and that review petition for now has been reserved. The judgment on it has been reserved. So what do we expect next?
Well, Bhairavi, the court will now give out its judgment whether the review pleas will be entertained or not, or whether the court will actually agree to review its own judgment. And I must admit that it's a bit rare that the court reviews its own judgment, especially in cases like these. And in the past as well, you've seen the review is also, there were reviews filed earlier as well, where the court had in fact said that it will possibly take some more time to look into this. That is why this bench was called in. And it earlier had said that the Sabrimala judgment that it's given out will be in full force, and it has to be enforced by the state government. But what's important to understand from today's hearing is 56 review petitions. That's a lot of petitions challenging a court judgment which had allowed menstruating women to enter temple. Now, the arguments were based on the idea of constitutional morality in Article 25, which is the freedom to practice religion, and also on Article 15, Part 2, which in fact talks about the issue of untouchability. And the court did expand the scope on the issue of untouchability here, but at the same time Justice Rohinton Nariman made it clear that he did rely on that, but the counsel for the petitioner should not be under any sort of hidden suspension that this is exactly what he sort of wanted to come out with. At the same time, apart from that, Indra Jaising also submitted to court saying that the two women had been threatened for their lives, and their mother was also being threatened early morning, with various sorts of all sorts of threats that they've been receiving, especially on calls, and some people just barge in. So she also made her bit of a point where she says that women have equal rights. So given all of this, the important takeaway is the Travancore Devasam Board, as you were talking about. Now, this board manages the affairs inside the temple, and this board today tells the court that they respect the judgment. They're not seeking a review. That came as a shocker for many, especially for Justice Indu Malhotra, the only dissenting judge in this judgment, and she was rather taken by surprise when she said, "Oh, this is what your submissions were," and she had heavily relied on them too. So this was not only surprising for her, but also all of us hearing the case there too. But this review, of course, very, very important. But still, as we've heard, women, a lot of women have still not been able to enter. It's just called an act of defiance rather than their right.
Right, Jessica, thanks very much indeed for joining us with the latest there. Jessica Taneja reporting on the Supreme Court hearing today in that important case. Sonia Gandhi's son-in-law, Robert Vadra, today presented himself before the Enforcement Directorate officials for questioning. His wife and newly inducted Congress General Secretary Priyanka Gandhi accompanied Vadra. Now, Robert Vadra is being questioned in connection with a money laundering case relating to alleged possession of illegal foreign assets. The case against Vadra relates to the purchase of a property in London worth £1.9 million. Vadra is being questioned under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. A Delhi court on February 2nd had granted interim bail to Robert Vadra till the 16th of February. The court had also asked him to cooperate with the Central Investigating Agency.